Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Jacksonville Jaguars Insider Podcast. My name is John Shipley. I am your host and beat reporter, and I have been your beat reporter covering the Jacksonville Jaguars for On SI every single day since August 2019, and we are continuing to push forward through yet another season together. As always, you can always find our 100% free, 24/7, boots on the ground Jaguars content when you follow us on social media such as Facebook or Twitter at Jaguars on SI. You can also find us at www.si.com/NFL/Jaguars. All right, folks, welcome to today's episode of the Jacksonville Jaguars Insider Podcast. My name is John Shipley. Today we are talking about the Jaguars, their third completed trade over the last 2 weeks, getting Tim Patrick, wide receiver from the Detroit Lions. Tim Patrick, of course, also formerly of the Denver Broncos, has been with the Lions for the last few years, caught, a little over 30 passes last year, 3 touchdowns, under 400 yards. They ended up trading a 2026 sixth-round pick. So now, and we've talked about this really for the last week, that the Jaguars have so many picks in that draft that these are the kind of moves they can make. These are the kind of moves that they can afford to do. Because, a sixth-round pick for a receiver 5, is it probably the most ideal use of a pick? Maybe not necessarily, but it's filling a very immediate and clear need. Like, this is a guy who will be active. This is a guy who will play a role. So, the Jaguars, I think, they had so many draft picks. They had a dozen in the 2026 draft that it only made sense for them to use that stockpile and see, what they can leverage around the NFL. And it always seemed like wide receiver was by far the most natural place for the Jaguars to go to try to find another piece via a trade. Now, it's the third trade. Like I said, the Jaguars are completed in the last few weeks. They got Colin Saunders, traded Luke Fortner to the Saints for him a couple weeks ago. And then, obviously, a few days ago, they trade Fred Johnson to the Philadelphia Eagles for a 7th-round pick. Now they complete their third trade. It's pretty clear to me, one of the big takeaways is that they aren't scared to self-evaluate and then act on it. And there's been Jaguars teams in the past where, they definitely have self-evaluated. But, like, for instance, the Jaguars last year, I refuse to believe that they felt comfortable with their plan at edge. They carried only three true edge guys last year on the 53-man roster. One of them was 7th-round pick Miles Cole. And then Eric Armstead, who they played at then. So, and the pass rush depth question was always a question for the Jaguars after the last couple drafts, but it just never seemed like, they really wanted to act on it. By the time the draft was over, they were like, okay, this is our team. We will let the chips fall where they may. Whereas James Gladstone, it seems, has been proactive about, okay, what are our still pending needs and how can we attack and address them? They've done it really a few different ways. Free agency, the draft, after the draft, they signed guys like DeJuan Smoot, Emmanuel Ogbah, Dennis Gardeck, Austin Johnson, for example. So they really, it seems like have been purposeful about how they're going and filling their remaining needs. So Tim Patrick, 6th-round pick. The Jaguars, it was always clear that they were going to look for a receiver. We talked about Austin Trammell in that 5th receiver spot and how that just didn't seem like it was set to last very long. It lasted, less than 24 hours, which was about what was expected. I don't think anybody really expected him to be on the roster much longer beyond that. I think the reason he made the first 53 is, they clearly had an idea for what they want to do at receiver. If you waive him today, then, he misses that first waiver order. And perhaps, teams have already filled their spots. Maybe they'll be less inclined to go ahead and pick him up. The Jaguars needed a number 5 receiver who could do a few different things. They needed him to be able to line up on the outside. They just needed a big perimeter body. They need him to be a red zone factor, which Tim Patrick has been. 6'4", I believe, 212 pounds. Has been solid as a depth guy for the Detroit Lions the last few years. He's not a guy who, to me, is going to really change the ceiling of the receivers room. Because they have their ceiling raisers in Brian Thomas Jr., in Travis Hunter, De'Ami Brown, Parker Washington, etc. But I do think he will raise the floor of the receiver room. I think that, he just gives them a different element, a big-bodied guy who can win in the red zone, win over the middle. And then also, to me, probably most importantly, is what he can do in the run game. So the Jaguars, they did not make it any secret, in my opinion, and from what I've been told, about, seeking a new wide receiver. I mean, Sean Payton himself kind of outed the Jaguars on it, saying that they were, in trade talks for their receiver, who they ended up dealing to the New Orleans Saints. So I think overall, for the Jaguars, this was a move that maybe not specifically for Tim Patrick, although I think he was an easy guy to kind of point to as, okay, he makes sense to do this for him. But I think overall, everybody kind of expected the Jaguars to look at that wide receiver position hard in terms of trades. And that's exactly what we saw. So I think Tim Patrick, he can line up on the outside. He does have experience lining up on the inside. Had over 150 snaps from the slot last year, even though most of his snaps came on the outside. He's an excellent run blocker. He can block on screens on the perimeter. And again, he just gives them a different body type, a different style of wide receiver than they otherwise have on the roster. He's not, to me, an X factor guy who will completely take a game over and now, he will be at the top of defensive coordinators' list when they're preparing for the Jaguars, when they're, defending the Jaguars. I don't think that should be mistaken. I don't think anybody should be saying, now, okay, the receiver room is now, flawless. This guy's going to have a big year, etc. I do think, still you have to think of him as a number 5 receiver. But ultimately for the Jaguars, they needed a 5th receiver who could fill the role that Tim Patrick can fill. He's not afraid to be physical. He's not afraid to win at the catch point in the red zone. And like I said, most importantly, he's not afraid to block. The Jaguars have an electric receiver room outside of him. Brian Thomas Jr. is a walking big play threat. Arguably already one of the NFL's best receivers. De'Ami Brown has showed big play ability as a vertical guy and after the catch. Parker Washington has made big play after big play in training camp. And then you have Travis Hunter, the number 2 overall pick, who is one of, the most electrifying probably players just on a overall basis of what can he do with the ball in his hands in the NFL. So the Jaguars have their guys who can be their explosive elements, but they needed that tough, physical, gritty guy who brings size, who brings what they don't have. Because Brian Thomas Jr. is a taller guy, but otherwise, Travis Hunter, Parker Washington, De'Ami Brown, nobody's going to mistake them for bigger wide receivers. And the Jaguars, they had a few options of guys who, perhaps they wanted to step into that role. But Eli Pankel ends up getting injured. He gets waived with an injury designation. If he, will now likely revert to the Jaguars injured reserve after clearing waivers. And then, of course, Joshua Cephas, who I thought was having a really strong preseason training camp, whatever you want to call it, before he ended up getting waived with an injury designation. He has since reverted back to their IR out for the year. Trenton Irwin, I think they signed with hopes of, okay, maybe he can be that guy. But Irwin, to me, just, you didn't see enough plays made over the course of training camp in the preseason. I mean, it definitely felt like he got his opportunities, but just did not seem like somebody who, looked like they should be set to be the number 5 receiver moving forward. But the Jaguars now have that number 5 receiver. It is Tim Patrick. The deal with the Detroit Lions is official, and Tim Patrick will now join Liam Cohen's offense as the Jaguars prepare for Week 1 against the Carolina Panthers. Thank you guys for listening to today's episode. Please make sure you like, follow, subscribe on Apple Podcasts and Spotify at the Jacksonville Jaguars Insider Podcast.